Hello and welcome to this episode of Claranet Cybersecurity TV. My name is Alexi Bitsios and I'm a Senior Penetration Tester with Claranet's Security Business Unit, formerly known as Sec1. In this episode we'll be continuing the OWASP Top 10 series, and today we'll be looking at A2 Broken Authentication. To quickly run over the agenda for this presentation, I'll start off with a brief introduction as to what OWASP is and what their top 10 list is, and I'll jump into a description of the Broken Authentication entry. Then I'll move on to how we can identify such vulnerabilities within web applications, and I'll finally close off with some prevention and remediation suggestions. So OWASP stands for the Open Web Application Security Project. Their aim is to provide cybersecurity suggestions completely free of charge so that anyone can use the information to improve the overall security posture of their cyber systems. Their top 10 list is a list of what they deem to be the most critical web application security risks, and they provide this information in what they like to call an awareness document. As you can see here, this is the list of their top 10 issues, and today we'll be focusing on A2, broken authentication. So broken authentication can be considered a range of different things. It can be, for example, the incorrect implementation of functionality related to both authentication and then the session management. So that is to say, both the authentication process, for example, logging in, and then how the web application uses the session management, how the application handles session management from then on. Broken authentication could also allow attackers or threat actors to compromise passwords, keys, session tokens, cookie values, etc. And it could alternatively be the exploitation of other functionality present within the web application that could lead to flaws which allows for the assumption of other users' identities or access to their supposedly private and secure data. So, how do we identify such vulnerabilities, given that it's a very broad topic? Well, one of the most common attacks that takes place within this area is a brute force attack, in which it could be potentially guided in the sense that, say, a list of usernames is enumerated, and then common weak passwords, etc., are used in an automated manner to try and log into the application. And then, if a lucky guess is made and a correct credential is found, that is then stored, and the automated tool will then continue through the list. Credential stuffing is a little more targeted than this. Threat actors will acquire large lists of data stolen from potentially other data breaches on other web applications, or potentially data breaches that have occurred within the targeted web application in the past, and then those credentials will then be used to try and authenticate. In the event that someone has reused their password, or they haven't updated their password since a data breach, the threat actor will be able to use this information to then authenticate as them. Another issue is permitting weak or default or well-known passwords. This can be something like logging in with admin, logging in with Claranet's password 1, and so on. And then finally, an application that uses plaintext encrypted or weakly hashed passwords can also be victim to a broken authentication issue, as of course plaintext is plaintext. Weakly hashed, for example, MD5 can quickly be identified and then encrypted. If a threat actor gains access to server-side code, they can then decrypt the passwords if they are stolen from a database. If the application uses a weak or ineffective credential recovery process, so if they say the password reset functionality or forgotten password functionality is somehow flawed, that can lead to broken authentication. If there's missing or ineffective multi-factor authentication, if a session ID is exposed in a URL, for example, someone may click on the URL, copy and paste it to someone else, and suddenly that other person has access to the victim in the scenario's account. And then if they do not refresh the session ID after successful authentication. Another common issue is if a web application does not properly invalidate session IDs or destroy them when they log out. If someone, say, logs out and the session isn't destroyed server side, all that needs to be known is what the session identifier was, and then a threat actor can use that, say, after a couple of days, hours, weeks potentially, to then re-authenticate as that user, even though they believed that the session was destroyed. This is also an issue if a threat actor does get access to an account and then steps are taken to log out that session. If the logout functionality is not working correctly, although it would seem that the threat actor no longer has access to that account, they do still have the access. So, in example attack scenario 1, we're going to look at credential stuffing. So a threat actor requires a list of known credentials, usually from previous breaches, or as we mentioned, it could be a breach from targeted web application that's happened in the past, or another web application that, say, someone has used the same credentials on. The threat actor then uses these lists to execute automated attacks against the targeted web application, and this attack, as mentioned, focuses on password or credential reuse. A list is then created with the valid login IDs, and whatever the the threat actor's objective was on the target, they can then go and perform it. Single-factor authentication. So, password rotation and complexity requirements are no longer considered the best practice. That is to say, switching your password every couple of months, having a 8-character password with an uppercase letter, a number, and a special character in it, etc. As this encourages users to use and reuse weak passwords, or they follow a pattern. And for this reason, this practice has been suggested to be discontinued. Now, to the best industry practices out there is to implement multi-factor authentication instead. Multi-factor authentication, this is a quick overview, revolves around something a user knows, something they have, and something they are. Generally speaking, when we think of web-based multi-factor authentication, we use something they know, so a username and password, and then something they have, which is usually a mobile device that receives either an SMS or a code from a multi-factor authentication application. Looking at example attack scenario number 3, session timeouts. So when someone authenticates to a web application, the session should expire after a reasonable amount of time. Consider the scenario where a user authenticates via a public computer, and then the user forgets to log out of the web application and instead just closes the browser. A opportunistic threat actor may come along, access the computer, and go to the same website that was previously authenticated by the victim. They'll find that the user is still authenticated after, say, a couple of days or weeks, and they'll be able to use that session just as if they had provided a set of valid credentials. Now, to wrap up, looking at some prevention and remediation suggestions, the number one suggestion that can be made is to implement multi-factor authentication where possible. It's something that's becoming very commonplace, and it's something that provides the best impact with the smallest amount of work, generally speaking, and it generally helps prevent automated brute force, credential stuffing, and credential reuse attacks, as an attacker will then have to take an extra step once they've somehow acquired access to this account to get that MFA code. Implement weak password checks and password length / complexity policies. Of course, we said that is no longer the industry standard suggestion to say that you need to use a long password and make it complex. However, that doesn't mean that we should allow the simplest and easiest passwords to be used. So for example, if a user wants to enter password 1, that should be in a list of well-known weak passwords, which is rejected, and a relevant error message returned to the user, asking them to provide something a little more unique. Then we have, so for user enumeration, for example, the same error message should be provided for failed registration, credential recovery, and any API integration of such functionality. So a threat actor can't go through a huge list of, say, registered email addresses in order to identify which email addresses have accounts associated with on a vulnerable web application or targeted web application. Ensure default credentials have been changed. If you have something which is some commercial off-the-shelf software, or maybe even some open source software that comes with a default user account, this uses, say, admin, the first thing that someone should do in order to secure this is, when they first log in, change the password to something long and unique, and of course, as mentioned, ideally enable MFA on this admin account, or even if it's just a regular account. So add the limit or delay for failed login attempts. That is to say, if, say, 5 attempts have been made to log into an account from the same IP address using the same email address, or even a different address, then a cooldown period of, say, 5, 10, 15 minutes should be put in place. All failed login attempts should be logged, and then an alert should be sent to administrators or web application owners when attacks are identified. Ensure that secure server-side session management is implemented. A new session ID should be generated upon login, and it's very important as well to not display the session ID in the URL, as was previously mentioned. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you learned something from this presentation today, and look out for our next installment in the OWASP Top 10 series, which will be A3.